Alrighty then, happy Thursday afternoon to everyone. Kind of a sparse crowd today, must be getting close to the weekend, right? We're starting a new unit today. We talked about the 8.2 event, which is a fairly small one. We're going to move up in scale in terms of climate warming events or the magnitude of them. The implications for this particular one are not, again, the scale of the temperature change that actually happened, but the ecological ramifications downstream. And so we're going to be dealing with ecosystems, larger views of critters and plants rather than a specific species. And so that's what we're up to now. I'll delve into that a little bit. Before I go there, any questions? A couple comments on the wrap up for session 3. Well, that's all repetitious. We don't need to do that. But these are some general comments. There was some that were a little sparse. There were one or two that were too long, but we're getting there. We're calibrating. I think that the general length of the answers is sort of 3 to 4 sentences, and we're getting there fairly well. I think we did it in one place, but we weren't explicitly asking for links. You know, we're trying to tie you back to some sort of literature. We're not expecting you to understand all of that literature, but we're expecting you to sort of, it is out there. It is something I can get some information out of, and we'll go with it from there. And so it's very helpful for us to evaluate whether you know what you're talking about if I can go look at the reference that you use. So rule of thumb, include the links so we know where you're at, where you're getting that information. Questions 1 and 2 were really a little bit different, but it might have been subtly. One was about how did those folks know, or that study or that research, that the climate changed? Now, one example, they used the literature and said, well, we know it's happening because so-and-so and so-and-so and so had said that. Somebody else reconstructed the temperature right there locally at that site. So there was a whole range of different ways that you could come up with whatever the temperature changes were, and then tying them to the Younger Dryas could require some techniques. And then the second part was, so what happened? So we're trying to divorce, for at least discussion purposes, the geologic or the planet behavior in case of the warming part of or the cold and warming part of the 8.2 versus whatever happened to the culture. And to emphasize that for ecological reconstructions, we're definitely going to focus on, you know, the background of the event itself we're going to study here is fairly minor and is more contentious, is a very contentious debate. I don't want to get too quagmired into the details of why it happened. Nobody disagrees that it did happen, but I want to think about what happened to the ecology. Yeah, okay, so that's general comments or questions on any specifics. Okay, let's go back in the geologic time frame then, and let's think about generally this organization. So we're going to go to something called the Younger Dryas. It's a time flash. Geologists like to put names on things. And the Younger, turns out there's a reason for it. I'll come back to, I think we got a pretty picture about it. But it's 12 to 11,000 years ago rather than 800 years ago. And it's a range. And the cause of it is really debated. I'm going to give you 2 examples of the cause, neither one which works too well, which means what do we know? Well, we don't know. It's debated still. Okay. For our purposes, 3 things that we are less debate about. Details, yes, but the overall picture is there were a bunch of large mammal species that disappeared, went extinct. That is not the only time, this sort of period of time here is not the only time that happened, but it's the last one of what we call the Ice Age extinctions. There's several time slices when the climate is changing, and we have mass extinctions of usually large animals. Large animals went away. The small mammals, they did better, but they had to change. So we'll see things we worry about, mice, squirrels, and that kind of thing. They had an adaptation to this, but it's not, they persevered through it. The other side of the coin that we're going to get, because we want to talk about the ecology, is we get animals, and of course we have plants. One of the things that sets up this, it causes some confusion in at least the science community, is that we're coming out of the Ice Age and the world is adjusting to it. So there's adjustment going on all the time. And then we get whacked with this younger, drier event. And so did the whacking sort of reflect, what did it reflected an adjustment in the period, but then the whacking on top of it. So this plant assemblages, which we're going to kind of find out take adjustment periods a little bit longer than mammals, for reasons that we'll get into a little bit. But the take-home point is that there were some changes in the plant assemblages prior to this time event, and then the event, and it was a big change, and then there was a warming out of that, and the plants kind of got into the stabilized configuration that they're at today. Not the plants themselves, the distribution of the plants. All right, and so the third big thing is that there was a large cultural change during this time. There was a series of, there's a culture known as the Clovis Point. It's a particular artifact that is used for hunting purposes. And that artifact sort of appeared, then disappeared in a fairly short period of time. So the culture, the interpretation is the culture that was using that came and went. All right, and there's endless debate about how these interrelate, and they have to some extent. You can't change these kinds of ecosystems and not have some sort of interactions. Now, there are people who would argue that the people changing also ended up changing their hunting patterns. You know, the thing you always see of the spears, folks trying to spear mastodons or mammoths. And did that cause them to go extinct? And there's some hypothesis of that. We'll dwell in that a little bit. All right, so that's the general view. The Younger Dryas itself, I said, is named after something, and it's named after that plant. That's a plant that's a Arctic species plant. You don't find it, you find it in northern Scandinavia, Greenland today, northern Canada. And so it's an Arctic. And so the younger, geologists say younger, middle, or older, because they might subdivide things into a period. So it's not the driest time, it's the Younger Dryas. There is an older Dryas, and then there is an oldest Dryas. But we won't get into that. So this is a time slice which get a lot of debate. We're going to call it that. I see I might have changed some things. I'm going to use this time slice, which means it's 1,400 years. I think I might have changed some text somewhere this morning to 1,200 years. Let's not get too rattled by if it's 12 or 1,400 years, but it's considerably over 1,000. That's the key take-home point. And so this was the latest of this cold intervals. We call them a different name today, but it doesn't matter. This cold interval has been known for over 100 years. Folks in present-day Denmark looked at plant assemblages stacked up and things, and they could tell that there was a change in the fauna. And then the Dryas was one of the things that came, and then it disappeared. So that's historically why we use this term. Looking at it on our graph, we're here today, the Ice Age. We haven't talked about the Ice Age. We'll do that. I mean, we've hinted at it. We played with the 8.2 event. Now we're going back a couple thousand years in time to this big jump. This big jump, the rapid in and the rapid out, are collectively, so the end of the Ice Age is usually, by convenience, talked about as where it flipped out of this condition. So we were in an Ice Age, it tried to get out, and then it flipped back, last gasp of the Ice Age, and then it went away in round numbers. The rapidness of this is faster than the 8.2 event. And in fact, about 20 odd years ago, there was a whole concept by the National Academy of Sciences, which define a lot of the science. And they talked up, there's a paper or a set of papers or a white page argument about abrupt climate changes, things that happen rapidly. This is the type section of it. This is the one that they basically start thinking about it with. And that's this sharp rise, both getting cold and getting warm. Sometimes it's a little hard to untangle those. I know this is, of course, about global warming, so we're really mostly interested in this, but you had something set it up. So it's 1,400 years, millennium, starts getting to longer time slices. The general rule, I can tell you, we're going to talk about 2 or 3 longer and longer time slices. The size of the change gets larger in the geologic record. Little guys, this is a medium size, and then we're going to talk about one that's even bigger, and the magnitude of the change gets bigger. One of the rhetorical questions I always ask in this class is, let's think about, okay, so you have 3 or 4 examples from the geologic record, and this one was a degree or 2, this was 3 or 4 degrees, this was 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. And then what is our prediction for sort of the next 100 years? Is it 1 or 2 degrees, 3 or 4 degrees, or 5 to 6 degrees? So that gives some context to what we're doing. Okay? Flipping the time scale just to confuse us. This is way back in time, 30,000 years ago. This is today. This is 15,000 years ago, and the rest of the numbers don't talk about it. This is one of these oxygen isotopes. It's from the Greenland ice core. This is the one where there was a fellow that was doing this analysis, and when they got down to the nitty-gritty of this analysis, they had a hard time publishing it because nobody could believe that at that time it could happen that fast. We'll go into it a little bit deeper, but basically this is sort of a decade of the change is expressed in about a decade. The interval lasts 1,400 years, but the big action took on the order of a decade, not thousands of years. And so what this does is this blows this up. Okay, so here's the Younger Dryas period, here's the 1,400 years we're interested in. Now we're going to blow this up, that's all the lines here, and because time is going this way now, here's the Ice Age, here's this warmer event, gives a different name entirely, and then a couple bingity bangs, and then it's down into this 1,400 years ago, and that's the warming. Okay, that's the decade. Must be a question on it so far. No? I don't explain things that well, and I know better. You got a question? No questions? No questions in the back. Maxine, no questions? Okay. All right, well, we'll keep piling it on then. The oxygen isotopes are not the only signal that shows this. Virtually every proxy that we have, and there's a whole host of them now, there's dozens, has some signal in it, which makes us believe it's a big deal. And so if you go, this is an ice core record where they pile up, and so you can go through all of this. This is a temperature proxy, so there's the cold and warm. This is well in the past, this is today, and there's a salt, there's a cation that comes in, and it's not there, it's there in the Ice Age, then it's gone, then it's there again. And this is a sodium, and same deal. This is methane, which is a greenhouse gas. The greenhouse gas is up there, up there, and the greenhouse gas goes away. Now there's nobody that's saying that the greenhouse gas going away is causing the temperature change. It's sort of the other way around. But it's interesting that the methane, which would be like to be rising and be these kinds of values, drop down for some period of time. Accumulation. On the top of the ice sheet, you worry about how much snow falls every year. During the Younger Dryas, it was low, jumped up, and then dropped back down, and then jumped back up. So this precipitation pattern is going on, and probably the wind patterns as it. These things are generally taken as proxy of wind intensity. They come from the ocean, their chemistry that's in the ocean. To blow them up on top of the ice sheet, you've got to have strong wind. So we're seeing wind, we're seeing temperature, we're seeing the hydrology balance. What we're not tracking, as much easily here is the ocean. What's the ocean's behavior? We're going to get back to AMOC for that. I'm going to give you two case studies or two hypotheses that have been used to explain the Younger Dryas, and then we won't worry about the cause too much. The reason I want to give you two hypotheses to you would appreciate that there's a debate about it. And the fact that we've been debating these things for a few decades tells me we don't understand it. Otherwise, we would have solved it and moved on. Prior to the 8.2 event, which was the lake that was up in here, there was a lake south of that. And this configuration's not great, but the point is that this water was all draining down, basically, towards the Gulf of Mexico or perhaps out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So it wasn't necessary. And this stuff is supposed to have drained mostly down into the Gulf of Mexico. And if you take cold, fresh water and pour it in the Gulf of Mexico where it's nice and warm, you warm it up and nobody cares because you're not going to mess around with thermal haline circulation. The conceptual idea here is there's some suggestions that the water diverted this way, which would put it back up in the Arctic where the turnover potential is high. So the Agassiz hypothesis depends on the AMOC mechanism. It gets its water someplace else, different hypothesis. The same thing, change the density. So it turns out the key area is a place called Thunder Bay, Ontario. Anybody been to Thunder Bay, Ontario? North side of Lake Superior? Something special. So basically this is the paradigm. It's the ocean conveyor belt. It's the concept is the ability of colder water to come out here and mess around with the overturning location or shut it off because it's supposed to be a bigger surge. This is our conceptual idea. We were talking about areas in here, but for our purposes, all of the North Atlantic is equally receptible to that. And so it's a guy named Broker who is now passed away, but was a leading climate scientist and oceanographer. And so he advocated for this, and he's advocated, and part of the reason he developed the Great Conveyor Belt was to explain the AMOC business. And so the villain here is the stored meltwater. And so, to make a long story short, this is Lake Superior. We're down off here someplace. And that's the lake itself. And this is a series of glacial features known as moraines. And so they mark the ice sheet being here, then here, then here, then here. Because of the geometry we're talking about, the water that's in the Agassiz Basin couldn't get into this basin until the window shade was open. Want to open the window shade, spill the water out, let it go out that way. I got involved in this project back in 2002 or 2003 or something like that to try to figure out exactly when that window shade might have opened. That was my job. Was the opening the right time? And all of the dots, and there's more to it, are places that we went and obtained samples to try to determine that. And I'm not going to bore you with all those gory details, but we basically found out that was a pretty challenging thing to do. The timing wasn't right. Close, but not quite. So that hypothesis has been abandoned by Broker and many people, not everybody, but it's not talked about. Up until we started doing our work, it was the leading paradigm. And then that's the way science works. Nobody talks about it anymore. You know, we didn't get awards saying, oh, you disproved this one. They moved on to something else. A second hypothesis that's more recent and has less, it didn't have as long a shelf life, say, as the meltwater hypothesis, but it was the impact hypothesis. The idea that there was an asteroid or some extraterrestrial body that ran into the ice sheet, and that sent out all the fresh water. So we're still not talking about AMOC, we're talking about different triggers for it. And part of the reason that the folks that developed this is because if you look around the globe, there are a bunch of sites where there's some evidence that is sort of at the right temporal level, right, what we call stratigraphic level, happened at the right time for the Younger Dryas. And the chemistry of these is really some strange chemistry. There's microdiamonds, for example. And microdiamonds can apparently only be formed when a meteor or a space body slams into the atmosphere. It needs a high pressure, high temperature. And there's some other chemical things. So the occurrence of these was a line of evidence to suggest that something is weird happening. The other alternative, there's something weird happening in the world anyway, and so maybe these deposits get biased in what they're seeing. The problem was, this whole hypothesis is nobody ever could find an impact site. It's kind of hard to have an impact that's going to change the whole globe and not be able to find evidence of where it was. So there was ad hoc hypotheses about smashing into the ice sheet. And then a few years ago, they discovered a crater up here. And it's covered with the ice, so nobody recognized it. And then there was a big flurry of resurgence of this hypothesis, because this is the way science works. And then they found out that the crater was 30 million years old, so that was a little old to cause the Younger Dryas, so that went away. Okay, so that's a second hypothesis. Up to this point, we're talking about a 1,400-year-long thing, end of the last ice age. The warming doesn't have a satisfactory answer, as far as I can see, unless somebody's come up with one in the last this morning or something. The long-held and recent explanations don't hold up. You will, when you start doing the data acquisition for today, you're going to get a lot of hits on what caused the Younger Dryas. Those don't matter to us. The evidence indicates that it occurred. There's no problem with that. And we want to really know what happened to the critters, the plants, the cultural. And really the thing is, there were a bunch of living things that changed. And I don't know why, not how they changed. They got whacked with some climate event. And as we said before, there's the extinctions of the large mammals. I'm going to go through some pretty pictures of what the large mammals looked like. I'm sure you've heard of some of them. A thing that might be less obvious is that the plant distribution changed. I'm going to walk through why that might be, and then introduce you to the cultural change, and it's going to be the Clovis. So those are three kind of major things, and it's always bugged people why they all occur at the same time. They're not totally independent. You've probably heard about extinctions because it's in the popular movie domain as the Ice Age extinction. And it says the extinction, which is a misnomer because there were several. The things that they had extinct or not, I haven't seen the movie, so I don't know the exact things, but they're a little stylized, so you take it as a grain of salt. But nevertheless, it gets in the popular critter. Here's a person for scale. These other things are drawn basically to scale. And you have large things, bears, avian products, a large beaver. That's a pretty good sized beaver. They didn't chew wood. Smiley mastodons, some large birds, rodents, big rodents, armadillos, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, some hyenas, Irish elk. Then there's a place up in. So the remains of some of these things can be found in Ohio, particularly this. I'm not sure about that one. Those are mostly South America, that, and maybe some others. So the point is that we've got evidence of these things. I'll go into them a little bit deeper. The mammoth, and the point of there's going to be mammoth and mastodons. I sometimes get them confused, but the mammoth teeth tells us that it was a grazer. It just wandered around grazing, like cattle do today. So it's it was dependent on plants. And the mammoth and the mastodon are different because these have really curly tusks, and these have straighter tusks. And they're slightly different in size, and their teeth are different. So the mammoth is usually like a symbol for a lot of ice age kinds of things. They were grazers. The mastodon was also plant eaters, but their teeth suggested they browsed, so they were eating shrubs. They were taking leaves off trees and things, not grasses on the ground. And you can see the height. I'm trying to, that's the Latin name. I think modern elephants are sort of this size, and they're obviously related to the elephants. If we walk through the list here of Smilodon, the saber-toothed tiger, and those things are sort of this length, so you don't want to get into a fight with them. They're expressed very well in La Brea tar pits. It's a place in California where a lot of them were trapped, and so you see the skulls and the whole carcasses, and this is a reconstruction of the mastodon, the saber-toothed tiger. A meat eater, yes. The Irish elk, they had those big, how they ever had neck strength enough to hold those antlers up, be hard to tell. They show up in caves in France as drawings on the wall. So, I mean, there are Homo sapiens that have seen these things. So we know a little bit. We know they existed. We also, I think this is the one, there's some evidence that people were hunting those. There's evidence that the people were jumping on the mastodons and the mammoths because we find bones that have been carved with tools. I don't think, maybe not so much did the saber-toothed tiger get used as a food source. The ground sloth, this is chewing, its big 3 toes chewing plants, and this is a critter that's more common in South America than here. And if you've been to the Cincinnati Museum Center, there's a variety of these critters in their fossil, and not in the fossil hall, but in the Ice Age hall that reflect the fact they were extinct. So now we want to worry about how do we know they went belly up at this time? And that's a tricky thing because you don't have evidence of it. The idea is that you have evidence as time goes on, and then you stop having evidence. So you take that time as when they went belly up. And so if we plot species this way, and you can't read them, it doesn't necessarily matter. These are places: Ireland, Britain, southern Scandinavia, Europe, Russia, the Central Plain, Siberia, southern Siberia, northern Siberia, Russian plain. Russia's big. That's not sure where it is. Wrangel Island is going to be an island up in the Arctic. And so what we see are these things. There's an individual that was living there in that area at that time, and at that time, 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 at that time. Never found another one. These things went on at this spot until that point, 12,000 years during the Younger Dryas. These things went on for a period of time. There seems to be one or two things in one place, and particularly on Wrangel Island, where there was this dwarf variant of the mammoth that persisted several thousand years after its bigger cousins went belly up. Okay, so these extinctions aren't an impact and they all go bye-bye one day. It takes a period of time. But for our purposes, they're all most of them went belly up during the Younger Dryas. Okay. That leads to all kinds of speculation why. Switching now to my larger context was that the small mammals underwent some changes, but they came through all right. And so we're talking about some fancy index of a particular rodent. And it's a fast breeding mice dominate the world. Yeah, that was a write-up, okay. So here's the Younger Dryas sign, long ago, today, and that's the blue behind print. What we're doing is some index of what that critter looked like. It had some standard, they've standardized a big sample set to see if it was exactly the same, the shape of it was also the same. And what they find is that, oh, it's this shape here, it makes a vacillation, and then it gets into its modern geometry. So there's some minor evolution of the plant, excuse me, of that rodent in order to adapt to those climate changes. Shifting over to plants. This is the more complex one. What we have here is a whole series of maps, deep time again. It's a good thing we don't plot time on the vertical axis because we go backwards the other way. And we get to the present day. And if you pick any one of these, there are various species, pine, spruce, birch, and grasses, prairie grasses. And so this shows the distribution. 18,000 years ago, prairie grasses were around in Alabama, Georgia, Florida. Today, they extend from Missouri, say, up into Saskatchewan. But there's an evolution of their pattern through time. There's an oddball pattern at the Younger Dryas. Birch trees. You couldn't have birch trees underneath the ice sheet. The ice sheet got smaller, the birch started coming back, and the birch started migrating to higher values, and then they get more or less in their stable configuration. But they do something, they're here and here, and they do something weird in the Younger Dryas, and then all of a sudden they're all over the place. Okay. Any volunteers to walk us through this spruce story, or do I pick on a victim here? Rise to the occasion, you got it. Talk to me about spruce evolution over time, particular focus of the Younger Dryas.
So before the Younger Dryas, they were pretty much staying south of the glaciers. And as that
Yeah, and for reference, we're right here. And I've got a bunch of spruce logs up in my office that are down in my lab that were buried by the ice sheet. And I know how old they were and all of that stuff. So I know the spruce lives in southern Ohio at this time. Okay.
And it looks like during the Younger Dryas, they kind of started to push north a good bit, and they also started to thin out a little bit in where they used to be stronger, a little further south.
Yeah.
After the Younger Dryas, they don't move back at all. They continue to go north and then stay pretty stable over the last 6,000 years.
There's a little deceptive because the greens catch our eye, but there are actually some species of spruce that have a wider range, but whatever the green things are definitely are going as he's suggesting. So the Younger Dryas is, and part of this is the geometry of the ice sheet. Nobody knows if they would have gone up here if the ice sheet hadn't been there. They probably would have. But bang, bang, all of a sudden it's really different. We can do pine trees, and pine trees today they have a bimodal population. You get pine trees out here a lot, and you get them, there's a southern pine species. They're in the Younger Dryas. It was trying to do this, and all of a sudden they didn't. Now, if we go here, what we see here are today's distributions. So there are places where both spruce and birch live. And there's places where they overlap a little bit with grass. This is bringing out this concept of ecozones. No plant or animal lives by itself. It has things that go along with it. And in general, plants, they have their buddies that we think of as today, those assemblages. This shows that those assemblages actually varied over time, and one of the times that they varied the most is right during the Younger Dryas. In fact, if you take a side trip, one of the ways that they look at these, they do statistical analysis by seeing what trees are and where, if it's this kind of tree, then today its temperature is this, and this temperature is that, and that temperature is that. So you go back in the past and you look at what the species were, and you can, by analog, determine what the temperature was. They do it sort of it's a spatial analysis of the relationships between it. The statistics are not anything we're going to worry about. All right, Plant distributions, any questions on those? Gentlemen? No question? Everybody, sometimes it takes class a long time to figure out just to say no. But I start then asking questions where you just can't say no. The third thing is the human culture. And as I said before, so this is centimeters. So this is a little larger than scale. And so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 centimeters, which the reality is that much. So these things are about 2 or 3 times bigger than they are. But they're pretty good sized things. 10 centimeters is like that. And they're made of obsidian. They're called most native, at least North Americans, used cherts in order to craft their hunting tools. Why? The way it breaks. What you see are little conchoidal fractures, and you can make a really sharp edge out of these. These things would cut your finger off. The culture that we're talking about had very large ones. A lot of these things are only this big. There's a lot of work to make one of those. There's a lot more work to make one of these. And you see that they have a flute, or they have an embayment on the bottom of them, which is often attributed or interpreted as being something to lash a stick onto, or a branch. So you've got a spear, basically. So these were large stone tools with flakes. They were only used for the Younger Dryas. And so they're called the Clovis culture, or they're called Clovis points. Clovis is the place where they were found, and then the name gets adapted, and then the culture is associated with the tool type. That's a fairly traditional archaeological way of dealing with something. So where are the tools? Where are the fluted tools at the beginning of the Younger Dryas? All of the yellow dots, including quite a few yellow dots in our backyard, and down into the southern regions. Some up in through here, up into Alaska. Most, however, the eastern seaboard of the US. The start of the Younger Dryas. 1,000 years later, 1,400 years later, nobody's using them. You can get into great debate. Why did they stop using it as tools? People were around. And the leading hypothesis, or some of the leading guesses are, there was nothing big left to hunt. If you go back to where the large species went belly up, well, if you're going to go after a large critter, having a large tool is a good advantage. If they go away, what are you going to do all that work to cut that thing? You can't take a duck with one of those spheres. It's bigger than that. Okay, extinctions, large mammals. Plants went where they could be happy. I'm going to go delve into that a little bit. A major at least North American culture. I don't think that culture extends to South America, and it probably doesn't extend to the New World or the Asian continent. The interactions, these things are all have to be somewhat related, but we argue incessantly about how. So I'm just trying to isolate them as 3 groups for now. This assignment is about gathering information, and we want to eventually think of the 3 major changes. I could ask you philosophically which is the most significant. People changing their culture, species going extinct, or the vegetation doing something it doesn't do today. So that brings us into deliverables. Now there must be some questions. All right, so this is the research part of it. And I'm going to ask you, I'm actually going to jump ahead to show you what we're going to do for the next deliverable, so this will make a little more sense if you'll bear with me for a moment. Open. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to think about ecotones, ecozones, and that's one of the things I'm going to have you look up. And so you can think about things as having some sort of north-south elevation or presence. And so we want to see how fast you can move that if things warm up. Do things warm up? The things that are cold today, do they come here? How fast do they come here? That's what we're going to worry about Tuesday. But to go back today to gather some information on that, we're going to worry about not that. We're going to worry about these things. How much temperature rise is really associated with the younger dryas? Find a reference that says several degrees. It's going to be a few degrees. It's not going to be 1 or 2. It's not going to be 10. Look around, see what they say was present, what kind of trees were present in Ohio, broadly speaking, at the younger dryas. And does that actually agree with what we showed on the map, those colored maps? Get an estimate by some source, and you're going to have different numbers depending on what you find for a source for when the younger dryas started and ended. And does it match with the younger dryas or not? And the answer isn't going to be super clear cut that they're exactly the same. There's going to be some slop to them. Start this ecological ecotone business by finding a map of the present day ones. What I just showed you was a map that you probably will find by searching for it. You probably find something else. Make sure you give me links to support your arguments. And keep in mind that we're interested in what happened during the younger dryas, not how it happened. Summarize what we're trying to do for the homework, for the deliverable, please.
So we're researching the three different groups.
Trees, people, back to trees again, or collective things of trees, okay? Mammoths aren't in this. We're not necessarily looking at animals for this exercise. Okay? Want to elaborate anything on that? No? Okay. I'm getting done earlier and earlier. That's a good thing and a bad thing. As we did the other day, if you want to start looking for this stuff now, I know people are anxious to get out and make sure that you've got the right references. I'm happy to chat about it. But otherwise than that, why don't we think about adjourning and reconvening on Tuesday. And I don't know how many people are going to the football game on Saturday, but that could be a real circus around here, judging by all the vans and stuff that are around. Anyway, have a good weekend.